Thank you very much. Obrigado. Thank you very much. I want to thank the mayor for his extraordinary words. I want to recognize Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to the community of Cascais and Estoril for this extraordinary conference. I'm going to be an optimist. I know one of the speakers following me is a professional pessimist. I'm an optimist, and I don't see how you could be a pessimist after seeing the extraordinarily opening act here. I wish Mr. Rubini had spoken first, right after that, and that we'd all feel very good about what's happening here. I do have to say, as we start this conference, that I've come to a lot of conferences in Europe. And I always, whenever I come to Europe, which is very often, the Europeans always complain about the Americans because we always act without thinking. But as we come to these conferences, we have to be very careful that we don't do what they do in Europe, which is to think without acting. The one thing that wasn't mentioned in my biography is I'm on the board of something called the National Democratic Institute. It's funded by Congress. There's also a Republican counterpart that is headed by a former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. And I do a lot of work for the NDI in southeastern Europe and the Balkans, trying to bring democracy, teach some of the internet and electoral techniques. I also want to congratulate the government of Portugal on what happened last night and as announced this morning. The terms are better than they were for Ireland and Greece. This is a very difficult role. The government began, actually, in fairness, some of the difficult steps as far back as 2005 that have to be taken. This is a very difficult problem. It's a very important problem that we solve, and I appreciate that it's moving forward, and I appreciate the rest of the European community for making this work. We have a long way to go in Europe. Let me say that as an American coming from 4,000 miles away, I want you to hear what my views of the European Union are, because you live with it every day and hear complaining in the stores and the gas stations and the sentiment in the polls that say people are mad about the euro, they're not sure about the European Union. The European Union is the most important experiment in human governance since the founding of the United States of America 235 years ago. This is the first effort. This is the first effort made on what was the most violent continent on the face of the earth for 1,000 years to overcome the extraordinary violence and division over nationalism and religion. It is an extraordinary thing that you're doing, and it must not fail. I understand that you have to live daily with the political problems that this causes, but the endeavor is a huge one, and that is why it is so difficult and so frustrating for you. It has to succeed. The euro is an extraordinary invention. Is it causing trouble? Yes, because the old way was for Portugal or Greece or to Ireland to devalue their way out of these problems. That is not a good long-term solution. One of my favorite countries in the world, because it's so beautiful, is Argentina. It has enormous potential. But government after government after government, they get themselves into financial trouble, and then they devalue their way out of it. They don't pay their bills. That can't go on forever. I am a liberal. That means in America that I am on the left. I am proud of being on the left, but the fact is those of us on the left have to balance budgets too, because you can't pay for all the social programs without then taking them away later on unless you figure out how to do it on a long-term basis. The struggle here is not to punish governments who have spent too much money. The struggle is to gain a long-term balance so that the European Union and the Eurozone as an institution succeeds. And it, of course, is not easy, particularly given the behavior of the multinational banks. The multinational banks are the ones that everybody blames, and they have much to be blamed for. They turned the financial markets into a gambling casino with things like credit default swaps and collateralized mortgage obligations and so forth. But they are not the only people to be blamed. Governments spent more money than they were taking in, And the one group of people that never gets the blame because we are politicians in a democracy, as the Prime Minister of Luxembourg said, our jobs depend on not telling the truth. The fact is that individuals also lived beyond their means, especially in my country. Our housing values went up and up, and instead of enjoying such a thing, we borrowed the money based on our new values and spent it, some on college tuition for our children, but oftentimes on boats and vacations. When you run a company that spends long-term equity on daily operating costs, you are running a company that will go broke. Not only banks and governments behaved badly, individuals behaved badly by taking on too much credit that we couldn't afford. There is a lesson for all of us. The truth is that our governments, whether they are right, center, or left, are no better than the people that elect them, and we as individuals have to take responsibility for the behavior that has hurt the West and the Western financial systems as well. Now, having said this, I am indeed an optimist. In fact, globalization over the years has produced extraordinary results. The standard of living in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, has gone, and in fact in Portugal, has gone up dramatically. I am old enough to remember what Portugal was like under Salazar and what Spain was like under Franco. There is no comparison to Portugal today in terms of what was happening 35 and 40 years ago. That is also true in Eastern Europe. Some of you may be from Eastern Europe. There is no comparison to what is happening in Eastern Europe today, despite the difficult economic circumstances, than to what was going on in Romania and Bulgaria and the Balkans 25 and 30 years ago. Democracy is difficult when people take on responsibility for their own governments as well as their own lives. It is a difficult thing, and decisions have to be made that are difficult. We are in the process together of learning how to do that. That is the struggle. The only thing that will defeat us is pessimism and fear. The truth is, one of the great things about America is we have a spirit of optimism. And the spirit of optimism is what will change things. You will change in Europe. You will get through this. You will continue to be the guiding, leading light in what is happening in the rest of the world. And I'm going to finish that at the end. I'm going to talk to you about how important the role of Europe and a united Europe is in terms of what's going on in the rest of the world. Because most of you probably don't realize in the day-to-day fighting that you have to do to get all this done, that Europe, in fact, is the world leader in many, many areas, some of which were talked about by the introducers of the conference. Now, I was asked to just cover a few small things. I was asked to talk about globalization, the Maghreb, the changes in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and I don't think we're going to get all that in today. But I would like to make some additional comments about globalization. We are, as a species, as a human species, today, because of the globalization, exposed every day to people that we had no idea about some years ago. In our generation, that is not so easy. I was a participant in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s. But I didn't grow up with anybody that looked any different than I do. What I say to the young generation of Americans, and about the young generation of Americans, is they have friends of every race, every religion, every ethnicity, every sexual orientation, and they all date each other. That means that while we had an ideal to build a different kind of America, while you had an ideal to build a different kind of Europe, young people are living that ideal. This is a phenomenon that's going on all over the world, and it's a very important one. Barack Obama would not be president of the United States today if something hadn't happened that has not happened in my lifetime. In the 2008 election, more people under the age of 35 years old voted for the first time than voted who were over 65 years old. Barack Obama is the president of a new generation. Not because age-wise he's a member of such a generation, but because he thinks like someone who's under 35. He is a true globalist, not just in the sense of a multinationalist who wants to do things more cooperatively, but in the sense that he is a product of a new era in humanity when we speak to each other over the internet, where our young people are not just citizens of the United States or Portugal or Europe, they are citizens of the world. There is a tremendous commonality between what happened in the United States in 2008 and what happened in Egypt in the beginning of this year. A group of young Egyptians under 35 years old got on the internet and began to organize to change their government. In Tunisia, a group of young Tunisians, et cetera, all over the world, this is a phenomenon. It is not an accident that the Chinese cracked down on the fear that there would be a Jasmine revolution, but cracking down is a short-term solution. You cannot stop the tide of history, and this under 35 generation is a new tide of history that is bringing the world together, and that is a fact. What is to become of the world with this new under 35 generation? There will be less nationalist and less religious friction. In the United States, people speak about the Tea Party. And of course, in Europe, everybody's fascinated with cowboys, and you think we're all a bunch of right-wing crazy crackpots. They are a small minority. But the truth is, the Tea Party is almost entirely 55 years old and older, white, and Christian. That is not what America looks like, and it's not what America is going to look like in 40 years. In 40 years, there will be no majority in the United States. There will be Anglos, there will be African Americans, there will be Hispanics, there will be American Indians, but there will be no majority. That is the new America. What the Tea Party is, and what I believe many of the right-wing national populist movements are, not just in the United States but around the world, are the dying gasp of a generation who believes that their race gives them the ability to run everything for everybody else in the world. That is not so, and we should understand and learn that in a cooperative way we are all citizens of the same world. And the fact of the matter is that we are all going to run the world together, and it is not going to be based on the artificial divisions left over from my generation and my father's generation before me. This is a new generation. The changes in Europe are going to be enormous. I was speaking today on the way over here about the difficulty that young people are having getting a job when they come out of university. The same difficulty, of course, in the United States. But what happens in the United States? They start their own business. In Europe, the university system is more sclerotic than ours. If you don't pass a certain test, you're diverted into a vocational system, or a little further on, you leave high school without an opportunity to go to college. That is going to fall away as more flexibility happens. We often talk, somebody raises the issue of socialism in America. This is a popular thing since Joe McCarthy 50, 60 years ago. The truth is that we have a safety net that's not strong enough, and you have a safety net that's so strong that sometimes innovation is stifled. There is a meeting point in the mid-Atlantic for both of us to learn from each other. That will happen. There will be more safety net in the United States of America and more innovation in Europe as this young generation harmonizes itself. There will be other innovations as the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, begin to rise. There was an article in the Financial Times a couple of days ago about a potential common currency between those. I think that's a long way off. The renminbi is not going to be a universal currency until the Chinese can allow it to be freely traded on the markets. But the idea of a third currency for developing nations is one that will happen, I think, I hope, and it will be a welcome addition to the two major currencies of the world today, which are the euro and the dollar. This is good for the world. It increases competition. It forces us to innovate. Finally, let me speak about Europe and its leadership role. I personally believe, and I'm not sure that everybody agrees with me, but even the Chinese agree with me in some way, that capitalism is the most extraordinary system human beings have ever invented in order to maximize productivity, because it harnesses our not-so-nice emotions like greed as well as our nicer emotions to get ahead. Now, I say even the Chinese agree, because the Chinese are in fact state capitalists. They have converted their system. The biggest danger to capitalism today is capitalists. Excess in any system leads to failure. In 1950, the average wage of a CEO was 50 times the average wage of an American worker. Today, the average wage of a CEO is 500 times the average wage of an American worker. I don't speak to you as someone from the left or the right or the center. I speak to you as someone who has observed 2,000 years of history. When systems become out of balance, they fail. If we want this system to work, we have to have a uniform, harmonized regulation, not too sclerotic, but this anything-goes atmosphere that we now live in cannot be permitted to continue. The truth is that the abilities of multinational corporations to move have outstripped the abilities of those who are responsible for regulation to do the regulation. Who is leading the way? Europeans. Europeans have the task of harmonizing financial regulations across 27 nations. Then we have to harmonize with the United States. If we can do that, we can begin to have reasonable, thoughtful financial regulations so we cannot have another meltdown. It was inexcusable for us to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. It was a mistake. It should be undone. But the key is harmonization. It doesn't matter if a large bank goes to the Cayman Islands. Once you're banking in your headquarters in the Cayman Islands, you no longer have credibility. That is not a serious issue that if we regulate too much, banks will leave. But it does matter that there's harmonization between the United States and Europe. Environmental protections. Europe has the strongest environmental sustainability legislation rules in the world. Everybody is approaching the European standard. Consumer protection. The Chinese make their export products, their high-end export products, for the European market. Why? Because they don't want to have two separate standards, and Europe has the higher standards between the United States and Europe. You are leading the way, partly because of the efforts that you take and the need that you have to harmonize among 27 countries, and partly because you understand, given your history, that there is not just an economic necessity to do it, there is a necessity, a moral necessity, to ensure sustainability if we are going to ensure our survival as a human species. And Europe is leading the way. Human rights. Europe is far advanced. You don't always live up to the things that you say ought to be done in human rights. Neither do we, and neither does anybody else. The United States has long had a significant effort to make sure that human rights are observed. And we have failed on numerous occasions. The important thing is to have a high standard and do your best to meet the high standard. And Europe, again, has the highest standards for human rights legislation of any area in the world. So it is essential that we leave this conference taking the view that we are going to act. I was stunned but not surprised when the president of Erasmus talked about the conference that we had had in 2000, and now it was 2010, and some of the things that we had hoped for, we had not achieved. That is okay as long as we have achieved a significant number of things on the list. Let this conference be a place where we may not achieve all the things on the list, but 2 years from now, when we are here again, we can look down that list and at least have gotten halfway there. Thank you very much.